I want to be honest about something before I begin. I almost didn't file this report. Not because I was afraid of the consequences, though I was a little, but because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. I'm a junior observer, 22 cycles out of the academy. My assignment to Kesari Station was supposed to be routine, background research, population demographics, trade pattern analysis. The kind of data work that fills databases and gets referenced in footnotes that nobody reads. I was not supposed to witness anything significant. That's what I keep telling myself when I sit down to write this, and then I close my eyes and I see it again. The way the human moved, the way the Draveth stalker's limbs stopped working mid-lunge, the way the crowd went absolutely, perfectly, terrifyingly silent, and I realized that what I witnessed was not something I can tuck into a footnote. This happened, I was there. Every word of what follows is accurate to the best of my memory and to the secondary recordings I was able to recover from the station's ambient sensor grid. Where I have filled in dialogue from memory, I have marked it clearly. Where I have speculated, I have said so. Everything else is exactly what I saw. My name is Zen Virali. I am a junior observer with the Galactic Xenology Division, currently assigned to Kesari Station as part of a routine demographic study. I have been stationed here for 14 local cycles, and in that time I have filed 11 reports, all of them unremarkable. This will be the 12th. For anyone unfamiliar with Kesari Station, and I suspect that describes most of the people who will eventually read this document, let me give you a brief picture. Kesari is not the kind of place you choose to be. It's the kind of place you end up. Situated at the intersection of 3 mid-tier trade lanes in the Outer Rim, it functions as what the official designation calls a transit facilitation hub, which is a very clean way of saying it's a place where ships stop to refuel, passengers stop to eat, and traders stop to argue about tariffs in corridors that smell like recycled atmosphere and something that might once have been food. The station itself is old. Not impressively old, not historically significant old, just old in the way that things get when nobody's had enough money to replace them and everyone's been too busy to notice. The corridors are wide enough for 3 Kravosi traders walking side by side, which means they're perpetually too narrow for the actual foot traffic that moves through them. The lighting cycles through 3 states, too bright, tolerable, and flickering. The docking bays are loud even when nothing's landing because the ventilation system has a resonance problem that engineering has been meaning to fix for approximately 6 years. The population on any given cycle is somewhere between 4,000 and 12,000, depending on the shipping traffic. A permanent population of about 900 maintains the station, maintenance crews, administrative staff, medical personnel, market operators, security. The rest are transients. Merchants, migrants, laborers, travelers who got cheaper passage through Kesari than direct routing and are now questioning that decision while eating something gray from a vendor cart. It is, by almost every metric, an entirely average Outer Rim transit hub. The one exception, and this is relevant, I promise, is the commercial sector on Level 3. Level 3 is where Kesari gets interesting, in the way that a wound gets interesting to a field medic. It's the station's primary market space, a sprawling open-plan commercial zone about 400 meters long and roughly 60 meters wide, lined on both sides with vendor stalls, exchange counters, entertainment alcoves, and the kind of establishments that don't put signs above their doors because their clientele already knows where they are. It is loud, it is crowded, it smells like 16 different species' preferred foods all competing with each other for atmospheric dominance. The floor is a dark composite material that has been polished smooth by decades of foot traffic and shows scuff marks from species whose foot structure includes claws or hard exoskeletal projections. It is, in short, exactly the kind of environment where something dramatic could happen and be witnessed by 200 people and still be difficult to document accurately afterward, because everyone was looking at something slightly different and remembers the sequence slightly differently, and 3 of them were communicating via chemical signal, which doesn't translate cleanly into standard archive format. I was in Level 3 on the afternoon of Cycle 4401.77 because I was conducting observation work. Foot traffic patterns, species distribution, commerce behaviors. The kind of data that makes up 80% of what junior observers collect and approximately 0% of what gets cited in significant research. I had been stationed near the central junction, the wide open space where Level 3's main corridor intersects with the secondary branch that leads to the entertainment alcoves, for approximately 2 hours when I first noticed the human. His name, I learned later, was Dak Orville. At the time, I didn't know his name. I knew what he was because I'd been briefed on human physical characteristics before my posting. It's standard procedure when you're working a station with significant human traffic, which Kesari qualifies as. Humans represent about 12% of the transient population on any given cycle, slightly above the outer rim average, because several human-operated shipping companies use Kesari as a fuel stop on their rim trade circuits. So I recognized him as human, roughly 30 to 35 years old by human aging standards, which my briefing materials told me represents early to middle mature adult for the species. Medium height by human metrics, which means he was shorter than me by about half a head, but taller than the Kravosi traders who were arguing 3 stalls down from where I stood. Physically, he looked, I'm going to try to describe this accurately, not impressionistically. He looked like someone who had been doing hard work for a long time. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way that visual entertainment media tends to depict physical competence, with deliberately arranged musculature and a specific kind of aggressive stillness. He just looked like someone whose body had been used extensively and had adapted accordingly. There was a density to his movements, a kind of economy, the way he shifted his weight and turned his head and set his feet that suggested someone who had learned, over years of experience, not to waste motion. He was wearing standard outer rim working clothes, dark, durable, slightly worn, boots with heavy soles, a jacket with a lot of pockets, the kind that suggests the wearer has learned from experience that you need to be able to reach things quickly. A work satchel over one shoulder, the strap worn smooth from use. He was browsing a vendor stall that sold mechanical components, small parts, interface adapters, the kind of hardware that keeps older ships running when manufacturer support has long since ended. He was turning a component over in his hands, examining it with the focused attention of someone who actually knows what they're looking at. I noted him in my observation log as human male, approximately 30-35 cycles equivalent, browsing commercial stalls, no indicators of concern. I moved on to noting other subjects. This is the part where I almost missed everything. I was watching a group of Kravosi juveniles, teenagers, I think, in human equivalent terms, who were clustered around one of the entertainment alcove entrances, and doing the universal adolescent thing of pretending they were definitely old enough to be there, while very obviously not being old enough to be there. It was a genuinely entertaining observation, the kind of small human, small sapient moment that makes demographic fieldwork occasionally worthwhile. That's when I heard the first sound. I need to stop here and explain what a Drovoth stalker is, because if you're reading this in an academic context, the species designation alone may not convey the relevant information. The Drovoth are an apex predator species from the Verac system, 3 jumps from Kesari. They achieved what xenobiologists technically classify as sapience approximately 8,000 years ago, which puts them well within the modern galactic community in developmental terms. But the specific nature of their sapience is complicated. The most important thing to understand about Drovoth cognition is that it's predator-dominant, meaning that the neurological architecture that supports their higher cognitive functions, language, abstract reasoning, technology use, developed on top of an existing predator behavioral framework rather than replacing it. Most sapient species that evolved from predator lineages undergo what xenobiologists call a cognitive restructuring phase, where higher brain functions essentially learn to suppress or redirect predatory instinct. Drovoth cognition skipped that phase, or went through a much abbreviated version of it. In practice, what this means is that Drovoth are fully sapient. They have language, they have culture, they have technology, they participate in galactic trade and diplomacy, but their behavioral patterns remain very close to their predator baseline. They respond to perceived weakness with dominance behavior. They respond to sudden movement with threat assessment. They establish and enforce territory instinctively. And they have a fight-or-flight response that is heavily, almost entirely, weighted toward fight. A Drovoth stalker in particular is the large male classification. Adult males average 2.3 meters in height, roughly double the mass of an average human male, with a skeletal structure that includes reinforced bone density at key impact points and a musculature arrangement that provides both speed and sustained force application. Their claws are primarily manipulative. They use tools, they work with technology, but they are also, incidentally, weapons. The keratin structures at the end of each digit are about 8 centimeters long and maintain a natural sharpness that would require deliberate blunting to reduce. They have 6 limbs, 4 locomotor, 2 primary manipulative, and an exoskeletal plating across the upper dorsal surface that functions as natural armor. The plating is not impenetrable, but it significantly reduces the effectiveness of conventional impact weapons. Their eyes are adapted for tracking fast movement in low light, and their reaction time, measured in controlled conditions, is approximately 1.4 times faster than an average human's. I am giving you all of this information because it is important. It is important because of what happened next. The sound I heard was a vendor stall collapsing. Not exploding, not being thrown, just collapsing, the way a stall collapses when something very large and moving very fast clips it while passing. A cascade of small components spilled across the composite floor. Someone cried out "Kravosi" by the pitch, a sharp tonal cry that the species uses for alarm. Several people in the immediate vicinity scrambled sideways. Then I saw it. The Dravith was moving through the market corridor at a pace that couldn't quite be called a run. It was too deliberate for that, too purposeful, but it was moving fast. Very fast. The crowd parted in front of it, the way crowds part when something large and frightening enters their space. Not organized retreat, but a wave of bodies pushing backward, pressing against stalls, filling alcoves, climbing over each other in the particular panicked way of a crowd that has just collectively decided it wants to be somewhere else. I got my first clear look at it when it entered the central junction. It was look. I've described the biological specifications above, and I stand by the accuracy of that description. But specifications don't entirely capture what it's like to see a 2.3-meter Dravith male in full threat response mode moving through a crowded market corridor. It was enormous. That's the first thing. Even knowing the species measurements, the reality of it hit differently. The plating across its dorsal surface was partially raised, a threat display behavior. I recognized it from my training materials, and its coloring had shifted from the neutral gray-brown of resting Dravith to the darker, more saturated tones that indicate high arousal states. Its 6 limbs moved in the distinctive Dravith gait pattern that prioritizes stability and force over pure speed. And even at that relatively controlled pace, it was covering ground in a way that felt fundamentally incompatible with the cramped commercial environment it was moving through. Its eyes, the large, forward-oriented amber eyes that give Dravith their excellent tracking vision, were fixed on something ahead of it. I tracked the sightline. It was looking at a small cluster of figures near the far end of the central junction. A family group, a Marani female with 2 juveniles, small ones, the kind of small that means very young even by Marani developmental standards. They were backed against a vendor stall, and the vendor, a stocky Kravosi male, had the particular frozen quality of someone whose threat response has just crashed between fight, flight, and the third option, which is don't move and hope it doesn't notice you. I have reviewed the ambient sensor data subsequently, and I've consulted with station security about what apparently triggered the Dravith's behavior. The short version is that the Dravith, whose name, I learned much later, was Gresh Uvak, a freight handler on a cargo vessel currently docked at Bay 7, had been in a dispute with a trade agent earlier in the cycle. The dispute had escalated. Gresh Uvak had sustained what he apparently perceived as a public status loss, which for a Dravith male is neurologically processed very similarly to a physical threat. He had left the initial dispute location, but the arousal state hadn't dissipated. Dravith don't dissipate arousal states quickly. They're not built for it. He had entered the market corridor in a state of escalating threat response, and he had, whether deliberately or through the instinctive targeting behavior that Dravith males exhibit when aroused, fixed on the smallest, most isolated figures in the immediate environment. The Marani family. 2 juveniles. Very small. I want to be clear about the timeline here because it matters. From the moment I first heard the stall collapse to the moment I identified what was happening, approximately 4 seconds elapsed. The Dravith was moving at roughly 8 to 10 meters per second. The Morani family was approximately 40 meters from the point where the stall collapsed. That gives you roughly 4 to 5 seconds from the moment I understood what was happening to the moment the Dravith reached them. I was not close enough to intervene. I was not trained for intervention. I was a junior observer with a data recording tablet and a standard observer's emergency signal beacon, and I was standing 30 meters away from a 2.3-meter Dravith in full threat arousal with an effective response window of less than 5 seconds. I activated my emergency signal. I don't know why I'm including this detail except that I think honesty requires it. I activated my emergency signal, and I started moving forward, which was not a rational response given the circumstances, and which I can only attribute to the fact that there were children involved, and my brain apparently made that decision without consulting the rest of me. I didn't make it 2 steps, because the human was already there. I want to try to write this as clearly and precisely as I can. I want to try to describe it the way I'd describe a piece of equipment or a sensor reading, factually, sequentially, without overlay. But I'm going to be honest. I've been trying to write this section for 3 days now, and the clinical version keeps sliding into something else, because what I watched was not a clinical event. It was something I don't have quite the right vocabulary for, and I've read a significant amount of xenobiology literature in my career. So I'm going to try to do both. I'll give you what happened in sequence, and I'll tell you what it looked like because the gap between those two things is, I think, the thing worth documenting. First movement. Dak Orville was not standing anywhere near the Morani family when the Dravith entered the junction. He was at least 20 meters away, near the mechanical component stall where I'd first observed him. He had his back partly turned. He was examining a component. Then the stall collapsed. He turned, and the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing I've been trying to describe accurately without sounding like I'm editorializing, is how fast his evaluation happened. It wasn't a gradual process. He didn't look at the Dravith, then look at the crowd, then look at the Morani family and piece together what was happening. It seemed, and I understand this is almost certainly a misperception caused by the speed of his cognitive processing. It seemed like he understood the entire situation in approximately the same moment he saw it. One look. Then he was moving. The intercept. He crossed 20 meters of crowded market corridor in a time I can only estimate based on the ambient sensor data, which clocked it at approximately 3.1 seconds. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 3 seconds. The distance was 20 meters and the corridor was not empty. It was occupied by a crowd in active retreat, meaning he was moving through a disrupted, chaotic space filled with bodies moving in multiple directions. He didn't slow down. He also, notably, didn't knock anyone over. Watching the sensor replay afterward, the path he took through that crowd was, I'm going to use the word surgical because it's the most accurate word I have. He moved through gaps before those gaps fully existed, as if he was reading the crowd's movement a fraction of a second before it completed. He reached the space between the Dravith and the Morani family, with approximately 1.5 seconds to spare before the Dravith would have reached the family. He did not have a weapon in his hand when he arrived. This is the part I keep coming back to when I try to understand what I witnessed. He arrived in the intercept position without a visible weapon, in a space of approximately 2 meters between an adult Dravith in threat arousal and a Morani female with 2 children, and he did something that took me several replays of the sensor data to fully parse. He stopped, just stopped, planted his feet, dropped his center of gravity in that particular way he had that I'd noticed earlier without understanding why I was noticing it, and he stopped. The confrontation. The Dravith stopped too. This surprised me when I watched the replay. In my briefing materials, in the xenobiology literature on Dravith threat response, nothing had suggested that the species' arousal state behavior included significant capacity for voluntary arrest. They're described as momentum-based in threat pursuit, difficult to redirect once the targeting behavior has initiated. But the Dravith stopped. I've thought about this a great deal since the incident. I've consulted with 2 colleagues who have more field experience with Dravith than I do. The best explanation I've received is this. The Dravith's targeting behavior initiated on the Morani family because they were small, isolated, non-threatening. Standard predator instinct target selection based on apparent vulnerability. But then this human appeared in the targeting path, in a position that the Dravith's neurological hardware apparently coded as intentional rather than coincidental, and the species' combat threat assessment function kicked in. The Dravith stopped because something in its neurological architecture looked at Dak Orville standing in its path and sent a signal that the signal archives of predator evolution apparently file under. Evaluate before engaging. It evaluated. What followed was approximately 7 seconds of the two of them looking at each other, and in 7 years of field observation and subsequent study, I have never had a more difficult time describing a moment accurately. The Dravith was making noise, low, chest-resonant vocalizations that I recognized from training materials as Dravith threat space announcements, the sounds that precede either dominance assertion or attack, depending on how the confronted party responds. The plating on its dorsal surface was fully raised. It was showing its claws, both manipulative pairs, in the deliberate display behavior that Dravith males use to communicate capacity for damage. Dak Orville was not making noise. He was looking at the Dravith. I've gone over this in my head a great deal. I've tried to find a precise word for how he was looking at it. Not fear. I watched his face on the sensor replay frame by frame, and fear was not the primary expression. Not aggression, which is what you might expect in a confrontation posture. Not bravado, not performance, not the kind of deliberate display that the Dravith was engaging in. He was looking at the Dravith the way a mechanic looks at a machine that's making an unfamiliar noise. With attention, with assessment, without panic. He said something. His exact words are in the partial audio recovery from the nearest ambient sensor. The transcript is attached to this document as Appendix C, but the relevant extract is this. Hey, big guy, look at me. His voice was even, not raised, not artificially lowered. Just even. Whatever happened back there, it's not these folks. You hear me? Not these folks. The Dravith's vocalizations intensified. Dak Orville took one step forward. I need to emphasize this because it sounds wrong when I write it, and I want you to know that the sensor data confirms it. The Dravith was approximately 2.3 meters tall. It weighed, by species average, somewhere around 400 kilograms. It had functional weapons, its claws, attached to 4 of its 6 limbs. It was in full threat arousal, and it was displaying, loudly and physically, the signals that in Dravith behavioral language mean I am about to cause injury. Dak Orville stepped toward it. The contact. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds, and I have watched the sensor replay of those 4 seconds more times than I can count, and I still cannot fully account for the sequence of physical events it contains. The Dravith lunged. It's the most accurate word for what it did, a full forward commitment of its body weight with the 2 primary manipulative limbs extended, claws displayed, which represents in Dravith behavioral terms the transition from threat display to actual attack. It was fast. I mentioned earlier that Dravith reaction speed runs approximately 1.4 times faster than human average, and the lunge confirmed that it was not an easy movement to track with the naked eye. Dak Orville moved. I keep writing that, and it keeps feeling inadequate. He moved. The problem is that the movement he made was. I'm going to try to describe it technically, and then I'm going to tell you what it looked like, because the technical description alone loses something important. Technical description. He displaced approximately 45 degrees to the lunge vector's right, rotating his body simultaneously so that the Dravith's primary manipulative limbs passed through the space he'd been occupying rather than the space he was now occupying. He made contact with the Dravith's leading right manipulative limb, a controlled grip at approximately the midpoint of the limb, just above the primary joint, and he applied a force that redirected rather than resisted the limb's momentum. He followed the rotation of the Dravith's body as it overshot, maintaining the grip, and he transitioned into a series of movements that the sensor data captured, but that my biomechanical knowledge is insufficient to describe with technical precision. What I can tell you is what the result was. The result was that a 2.3-meter, 400-kilogram Dravith stalker was on the floor. That is, I need to say this clearly. It was on the floor. All 6 limbs, which means it had gone from a vertical attack lunge to prone, and the transition had taken approximately 2.2 seconds from the initiation of the lunge. The sensor data shows that Dak Orville never fully lost his feet. He went to one knee during the sequence, then came back up. He was still holding the Dravith's manipulative limb. And the Dravith, which was 400 kilograms of apex predator species, with an evolutionary history of being the thing that puts other things on the floor, was on the floor, and something about its position. The angle of the limb Dak Orville was still holding, the geometry of how its body weight was distributed, appeared to be preventing it from regaining a standing position without his cooperation. I've consulted with a kinesiologist colleague about this since the incident. The explanation I received, in brief, is that certain joint structures are common across a surprising range of sapient species due to the physics of bipedal or multi-limbed locomotion, and that an expert in joint manipulation techniques can, in some circumstances, control a much larger body through a single compromised joint because the alternative, forcing the joint in the direction it's being leveraged, is more neurologically alarming than remaining in the constrained position. The body, even a Dravith's body, prefers the painful but controlled situation to the painful and uncontrolled one. That is what the technical description gives you. What it looked like was something I genuinely struggled to convey. It looked effortless. That's the wrong word, I know that. It was obviously not effortless. The sequence required precise timing, specific anatomical knowledge, a level of physical conditioning that doesn't happen without sustained and deliberate effort, and a degree of calm under what is objectively one of the more terrifying threat conditions a human-sized being can face on the outer rim. It was not effortless. But it looked effortless. The same way that watching a truly expert pilot dock a freighter makes it look like the ship is just gently deciding to stop where it stops. The competence was so complete that the effort underneath it became invisible. The market corridor was quiet. I want to say that again because I don't think I can fully communicate how strange it was. Level 3 of Kesari Station is not a quiet place. I've been observing it for 14 cycles, and I have literally never heard it quiet. There's always noise, vendor calls, transaction arguments, the ambient hum of foot traffic, the ventilation system's resonance issue, the general sonic output of 4,000 to 12,000 beings going about their business in a relatively confined space. It was quiet. The entire commercial sector, for approximately 6 seconds after the Dravith hit the floor, produced no sound that I could detect over my own heartbeat. Then this is in the sensor data, and it's something I find myself returning to. Someone began to applaud. Not a crowd response, not a wave of applause building from multiple points. One person, somewhere in the crowd, began clapping. Slow at first, a little uncertain, as if they weren't entirely sure it was the right response but couldn't think of a more appropriate one. Then another person joined in. By the time I reached the junction, running, by this point, my observer's reserve entirely abandoned. The sound had built into something genuine. A few dozen voices and the percussive sound of multiple species, equivalents of applause mixing together into something that sounded less like a performance response and more like a collective exhale. Dak Orville was still crouched next to the Dravith. He'd released the limb. The sensor data shows him releasing it gradually, checking the Dravith's response before fully releasing, which is itself an interesting detail, and he was talking. His posture was not triumphant, not aggressive, not the way someone stands when they've just done something remarkable and they know it. He was crouched, body angled slightly away from the Dravith to reduce threat signaling, and he was talking in a low, even voice. I got close enough to catch fragments of what he was saying. "You're okay, you're good. Nothing's broken, I made sure of that. Just stay there for a minute, breathe." The Dravith, Gresh Uvak, the freight handler from Bay 7, was breathing. That sounds like a strange thing to note, but at the time it was the most relevant information available, because for a moment I genuinely wasn't sure. It made a sound, not the vocalizations from before, something lower, more singular. My Dravith is not good enough to parse it precisely, but it didn't register as aggression. Dak Orville said, "Yeah, I know it's been a bad day." Then station security arrived, approximately 90 seconds after the incident, which is actually a fairly impressive response time for Kesari. I said that they arrived. I didn't say they entered the junction with any particular confidence, because the first 2 officers through the corridor entrance stopped when they saw the Dravith on the floor and the human crouched next to it, and there was a moment, sensor data confirms it, roughly 3 seconds, where they just stood there. One of them eventually said something into his communicator. I was close enough to hear the communication, and what he said was, Situation is Situation is contained. We need a Dravith behavioral specialist medical team, and I think somebody needs to talk to the human. Section 8, the Mirani family. I've been documenting Dak Orville and the Dravith because that's the incident. But I want to take a paragraph to record something else that happened in the immediate aftermath, because I think it belongs here. The Mirani female, her name, I learned from the security incident report, was Savia Ralun, traveling with her 2 children, Emin and Savi, ages 4 and 6 in Mirani developmental terms, which translates to approximately toddler and young child in human equivalent, came out of the vendor stall she'd been backed against. She was shaking. This is observable on the sensor data, the fine tremor in her hands, the rigid set of her jaw that I recognize as the physical expression of someone who is holding themselves together through deliberate effort. She walked to where Dak Orville was still crouched next to the Dravith. He looked up at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said something in Mirani that the ambient sensor caught, but that I've had translated only approximately. The translator notes that the Mirani she used was formal register, not everyday conversational, the kind of register that Mirani use for very significant statements. The translation the system produced was, "You moved toward it. You could have run." Dak Orville looked at her children. The older one, Savi, was watching him with enormous eyes. The younger one, Emin, had her face pressed against her mother's shoulder and was not watching anything. He said, "Yeah, well." He didn't finish the sentence. He looked at Savi for a moment longer, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatic, not performed. Just a small, private something that I'm not sure I have the cultural literacy to decode accurately. Then he said, "They're okay." Savia Ralun said they were okay. Dak Orville nodded once and turned back to the Dravith. I've thought about that exchange a lot. I think it might actually be the part of this incident that I find most difficult to categorize, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple in a way that keeps evading my attempts to analyze it. Station security took Dak Orville for a standard incident interview approximately 20 minutes after the event. I know what was asked and what he said because Chief Security Officer Bren Tallius filed a full interview transcript, which I've attached as Appendix D, and because Officer Tallius, who I've developed a working relationship with over my 14 cycles on the station, agreed to discuss the interview with me off record. I'm going to summarize rather than reproduce the full transcript, both for brevity and because Appendix D contains the complete record. Security established that Dak Orville was a licensed cargo pilot, currently between contracts, who had been at Kesari for 4 local cycles waiting for a freight assignment. He had no outstanding warrants, no significant security record anywhere in the galactic network, and his documentation was current and in order. He was, by every administrative metric, an entirely unremarkable outer rim transient waiting for his next job. They asked him about the incident. He described it briefly. His account of the sequence of events matched the sensor data closely. He didn't editorialize much. He said the Dravith was in a bad state and was going to hurt someone, and he got in the way and it worked out. That's a fairly close paraphrase of how he actually described it. They asked him where he learned what he did. He said, "I grew up on the outer rim. You pick things up." This is, as Officer Tallius noted to me, technically true but maximally unhelpful as an answer. The officer pressed for more detail. What Dak Orville eventually offered, with what Officer Tallius described as the particular patience of someone explaining something they consider self-evident, was a brief account of approximately 15 years working cargo runs in the outer rim, a period of contract security work on a Verak trade vessel. And this is the relevant part. About 7 years of studying what he called practical joint mechanics, under a human instructor who had apparently spent 30 years specifically studying the anatomical structures of species in the galactic community for the express purpose of understanding how to incapacitate them if necessary. The instructor's name, as recorded in the interview transcript, was Maurice Orville. His mother, I sat with that for a while when I read it. They asked him if he understood that intervening in an incident involving a Dravith in threat arousal was considered, by standard risk assessment protocols, an extremely high-danger action. He said, I figured. They asked why he did it. He said there were kids. Officer Talius, who has been doing security work on Kesari for 11 years and has developed what he describes as professional skepticism about most things, told me that was the answer that stayed with him longest. There were kids, he said to me. That's it, that was the whole explanation. Section 10, the crowd. I want to spend some time on the crowd response, because as a xenologist, it's something I find genuinely significant, and I don't want to bury it in the procedural sections. By the time I reached the junction, the crowd that had retreated from the corridor had, in large part, come back. This is normal post-incident crowd behavior. Threat resolves. People return to see what happened. But the character of the crowd's presence was something I want to describe carefully, because I think it's data. There were beings from at least 11 different species in the crowd I was able to observe. Kravosi, Morani, 2 Velith traders who'd been at an adjacent stall, a cluster of Tarsh labor migrants who worked the docking bays, several humans, 1 elderly Sarene academic who I recognized from the station's research library, and who had absolutely no business being in level 3 but was there anyway, looking at the junction with an expression I can only describe as scholarly rapture. What struck me was not the size of the crowd or the noise level, which was considerable by this point. What struck me was the directional consistency of their attention. They were all looking at Dak Orville. Not at the Dravith, which was arguably the more visually striking element of the scene. Not at the security officers who'd arrived and were establishing a perimeter. At the human, crouched next to an apex predator, talking to it quietly. The Velith traders were communicating with each other via their chemical signal system, which I can't parse in real time, but their posture was the open front stance that Velith use in the presence of something they're categorizing as significant. The Kravosi vendor whose stall had been clipped by the Dravith's entry was standing at his stall's edge, one hand braced on the counter, watching with his mouth slightly open. The Tarsh labor migrants were doing something I had to look up later, a specific gesture, touching the second joint of their primary arm to their chest, in a brief, repeated motion that my reference materials inform me is a Tarsh expression of deep respect that predates their contact with the galactic community by several thousand years. The elderly Sarene academic was writing something on a data pad. I thought about asking her what she was writing, then decided not to interrupt. What I'm trying to convey is that the crowd response transcended the specific cultural frameworks of the species present. There was no single universal language of respect or recognition in the galactic community. We're too diverse for that, too varied in our evolutionary histories and cultural traditions. But the response I witnessed looked as close to universal as I've ever seen in 14 cycles of field observation. The forms were different. The underlying thing being expressed was the same. I was awake for most of the night following the incident. I'm including this in the report because I think it's relevant to understanding why I'm framing this as something more than a security incident. I was awake, and I was thinking about what I'd watched, and around the 3rd hour of not sleeping, I picked up my xenology training materials and started reading. I read about threat response parameters. I read about body mass comparative combat physics. I read about the documented history of interspecies confrontation on outer rim stations, and what the outcomes typically look like when a smaller sapient engages a larger one in a threat arousal situation. The short version is, the outcomes typically don't look like what I watched today. The xenology literature is very clear about this. Size and mass matter. Skeletal reinforcement matters. Species-specific combat adaptations matter. The general picture the literature paints is of a relatively straightforward relationship between physical capability and confrontation outcomes, with occasional exceptions that are usually attributed to technological assistance. Dak Orville had no technological assistance. He had a work jacket with a lot of pockets and a satchel, and some kind of small folding tool that I caught a glimpse of on the sensor replay, but that he never opened. What he had was knowledge. Specifically, knowledge that someone had spent 30 years developing and then spent time passing on to her son, who had then spent 15 or more years working in environments where the knowledge was occasionally practically applicable. I kept thinking about what his mother must have been like. What kind of person spends 30 years learning the joint architecture of every major sapient species in the galactic community well enough to be able to exploit it in a practical situation? What does that even look like as a life project? What combination of intellectual curiosity, pragmatic thinking, and something that I can only call a very particular kind of care for self-preservation leads someone to develop that specific body of knowledge? And then what kind of person teaches it to their kid? I kept thinking about the moment the Dravith lunged. The transition from confrontation posture to attack, which represents for a Dravith the absolute commitment. There's no defensive reading of a Dravith lunge. It's not a feint, it's not a warning, it's the thing you do when you've decided to cause damage. And Dak Orville moved 45 degrees. Not backward, not sideways. 45 degrees to the vector, into a position where he could work with the momentum rather than against it. And he put a 400-kilogram apex predator on the floor in 2.2 seconds using, as far as I can tell, almost nothing except precisely applied knowledge of where force needed to go. I kept thinking, that's not instinct. You can't develop that instinctively. That's education. That's years of somebody teaching somebody else how to understand a body, any body, sapient body, any species body, as a physical system with exploitable mechanical properties. And then more years of that somebody practicing until the knowledge moved from their head into the faster, quieter place where responses come from before you've decided to make them. I kept thinking, this is what humans do. Not the specific skill. I'm sure there are other species in the galactic community who have developed comparable techniques. I'm sure the knowledge Maurice Orville spent 30 years building has equivalents and parallels and distant cousins in 100 different cultural traditions across 1,200 light years. But the mechanism, the thing underneath the specific skill, the decision, and it is a decision, somebody made it at some point, to take the universe as it actually is rather than how you'd prefer it to be, to look at the fact that you are small and the universe is full of things that are much larger than you, and rather than building a wall against that fact, to lean into it, to study it, to spend 30 years learning exactly how the large things are put together, so that you understand them better than they understand themselves. And then to pass that knowledge to the next person. That's what I kept thinking about. I saw Dak Orville once more before he left the station. This wasn't planned. I was at the Level 2 commissary, getting something to eat before my morning observation session, trying to process the fact that I'd been awake for approximately 20 hours and was about to write the most significant field report of my career. And he came in. He got food. He sat down at a table near the viewport that looks out over the docking bays. He ate. I watched him for a moment. And I know this is not something I should admit in an official report, but I'm including it anyway because I think the honesty serves the document. He looked tired. Not injured, not troubled, not in any obvious state of ongoing reaction. Just tired. The kind of tired that settles into a person's shoulders when they've been running on something other than rest for a while. He was watching the ships in the docking bays through the viewport. There was a freighter maneuvering into Bay 12. A big old Kravosi bulk hauler, the kind of ship that makes a lot of noise and takes a long time to dock and has probably been doing this circuit for longer than most of its crew has been alive. He watched it dock with the particular focused attention I'd noticed before, and then his food was ready and he ate it. At some point, he noticed me looking at him. I should have looked away. I didn't. The report-writing part of my brain had taken over from the socially appropriate part of my brain, and I was trying to document him the way you document anything significant before the moment passed. He looked at me for a moment. There was a kind of recognition in it, not of me specifically, but of the type of attention I was directing at him. The "you're studying me" recognition, which I imagine he'd encountered before. He gave me a very small nod. I gave him one back. He went back to his food. I sat there for another 10 minutes, then left to write this report. Section 13, the DRAVTH, follow-up. For completeness, Gresh Uvak was remanded to Station Medical, assessed by both a Dravith behavioral specialist and a general physician, and found to have sustained no significant physical injury from the incident. The joint that Dak Orville controlled was bruised. Sensor data shows the controlled pressure was sustained at levels calculated to constrain without causing lasting damage, but there was no lasting impairment. He was detained for a standard post-incident assessment period. And then, after consultation with the station's legal office and the behavioral specialist, released with conditions. The conditions included mandatory behavioral counseling from a Dravith specialist practitioner, a temporary restriction on station access pending the counseling completion, and contact with the shipping company whose vessel he was contracted to. The Morani family, Savia, Emin, and Savi Ralun, were confirmed safe and uninjured. They were offered priority boarding on their connecting transport, which departed 6 hours after the incident. Station records show they accepted. Dak Orville left Kesari on a freight run to the Teln system approximately 30 hours after the incident. He filed no complaint, made no claim for any recognition or compensation, and his departure documentation listed his occupation as cargo pilot, independent contractor. The mechanical component stall he'd been browsing when the incident began filed a damage claim for the stall that the Dravith clipped on entry. It was settled through standard station liability procedures. I've been a xenologist for 22 cycles. I came to this field because I'm genuinely curious about other beings, the variety of ways that sapience organizes itself, the different shapes that intelligence and culture and experience take across the species of this community we've all ended up in together. Most of my work involves counting things, trade flows, population distributions, interspecies interaction frequencies. I count and I record, and the records go into databases, and occasionally someone uses the databases to write a paper that influences a policy recommendation that affects the lives of some beings somewhere in a way that nobody will ever directly trace back to me standing in a market corridor, counting how many Kravosi buy tech components versus how many Velith do. I'm not complaining about this. It's useful work, unglamorous but useful. But in 22 cycles of this work, I have almost never been stopped in my tracks. What I watched yesterday stopped me in my tracks. I've been trying to understand exactly what it was that I found so affecting, and I think I've finally arrived at something I can articulate. It wasn't the physical capability. Though that was remarkable. The mechanics of what Dak Orville did to a 2.3-meter Dravith in 2.2 seconds represent a degree of practical applied knowledge that I'd put into a xenology research paper without hesitation if I could figure out the appropriate category. It was the thing underneath the physical capability. The decision, the moment, or rather the accumulation of moments, years of moments, his mother's years and his own years stacked on top of each other, that produced the response I witnessed. The response that was fast enough and precise enough and calm enough that it looked, to a 2.3-meter apex predator's threat assessment system, like something worth pausing to evaluate. Humans are not, by galactic community standards, a physically dominant species. They are mid-range. They're softer than a Dravith, less quick than a Velith, less physically resilient than a Kravosi, without the chemical communication depth of the Tarsh or the distributed nervous system of the Sarine. On most of the standard xenobiological metrics, they're fine, adequate, capable. What they are, which I don't think our field has adequately grappled with, is adaptive in a way that our existing taxonomies don't quite capture. The adaptiveness I witnessed yesterday wasn't biological. It was deliberate. It was chosen. Someone decided to spend 30 years learning something genuinely difficult and unusual and practical, and then someone else spent years making that knowledge part of their operational capacity. And then a moment arose that required it, and the moment got what it required. You can do that regardless of your species' physical specs. You can do that if you're soft and mid-range and don't have claws. You can do that if the universe is full of things larger than you, because the things larger than you have joints, and joints have angles, and angles have physics, and physics is the same everywhere. I don't know if that's what humans collectively understand about themselves. I'm not sure, based on what I've read and what I've observed, that they do. I think it might be something they carry without fully articulating it. A background assumption that the universe is a problem to be understood rather than a fact to be accepted. That the gap between what they are and what they need to be is a space for knowledge rather than a barrier. I'm speculating. I want to be clear about that. I'm a junior observer at a mid-tier outer rim transit hub, and my sample size for this observation is one cargo pilot who ate his breakfast quietly and went to catch a freight run to the Teln system. But I filed this report because I think the sample matters. I filed this report because I watched a human step into the path of an apex predator in full threat arousal. With no weapon, with no backup, with nothing except what he knew and what he'd been taught, and what he'd decided to do with both of those things. And I watched the apex predator stop. I think that's worth putting in a database.